The night Virginia Easton rode into Harding County, the sky above the Texas Panhandle split open with lightning so fierce it looked like God himself was signing his name across the heavens, and every soul in the town of Redrock held their breath without knowing quite why. It was the autumn of 1883, and Redrock was not the kind of town that inspired poetry. It sat low against the flat earth like something that had been pressed down and forgotten, a scattering of clapboard buildings along a single main street, a livery at one end and a church at the other, and between them all the machinery of a small Western life. The general store, the telegraph office, the saloon that also served as the town's only hotel, and the sheriff's office with its single barred window facing east. The wind came through in October like it had a grudge, and the dust never really settled, and the people who stayed in Redrock stayed because they had no better ideas, or because the land had gotten into their blood in a way they couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. Silas Crawford was 31 years old and had been sheriff of Harding County for 4 of those years. He was the kind of man who filled a doorframe without effort, and who carried his silences the way other men carried their weapons deliberately, and with the understanding that they could do damage. He had dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular color of the sky just before a storm, not blue and not gray but something between the two, restless and deep. He had broad hands that were good at fixing things: fences, wagon wheels, the occasional broken jaw that required setting, and he wore his badge like it was just another piece of metal, which it was, and yet somehow everyone in town understood that it meant something serious when Silas Crawford pinned it on in the morning. He had not written a single letter in 7 years. This was known about him the way certain things become known in small towns, not from any direct admission but from the accumulation of small observations. Mrs. Hutton at the post office noted that no mail ever came for him, and no mail ever went out from him. His deputy, a young man named Cody Fitch who talked enough for both of them, had once asked him if he had family somewhere, and Silas had looked at him with those storm-colored eyes and said, quietly, that he did not discuss that. Cody had not asked again. There had been a life before Redrock. Anyone could see that much. There were the kind of lines around Silas Crawford's eyes that didn't come from squinting into the sun alone. There was a quality to his stillness that suggested he had once been something other than still, that at some point in his history he had been a man who moved through the world with a different kind of energy, louder or faster or more given to feeling, and that something had happened to change all of that. The townspeople of Redrock were not unsympathetic. They simply left him alone, which was the Western way of showing care. He kept the peace. He was fair when fairness was possible and firm when it was necessary. He stopped the cattle disputes before they became range wars, and he locked up the drunks on Saturday nights and released them on Sunday mornings with enough water to wash their faces. He ate his supper at the boarding house run by Mrs. Clara Webb, who fed him well and asked him nothing personal, and he slept in the small room above the sheriff's office, and every morning he watched the sun come up over the flat land, and he thought about whatever it was that men like him thought about in the early morning quiet before the world asked anything of them. He did not write letters. He did not write at all. The pen and inkwell on his desk were used only for official documentation, witness statements, property disputes, the occasional death report that had to be filed with the territorial court in Amarillo. Words on paper felt like a door he had long since locked, and he had thrown the key somewhere he did not intend to go looking. Then Virginia Easton rode into his county in the middle of an October lightning storm, and everything changed. She came in from the South Road, alone, which was already remarkable. Women did not ride alone into Redrock at 10 o'clock in the evening in the middle of a storm, not as a general rule. She was riding a bay mare that was exhausted but still game, foam at the horse's neck and mud up to its fetlocks, and she herself was soaked through, her dark hair plastered against her face, her riding coat so wet it had turned from brown to near black. She pulled up in front of the sheriff's office because it had a lamp burning in the window, and she dismounted with the careful movements of someone who had been in the saddle for a very long time and was not going to let their body's complaints be visible to strangers. Silas heard the horse before he heard the knock. He was sitting at his desk by the lamp, not writing anything, just sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the rain coming down the window in silver sheets. He heard the horse stop outside and he was already on his feet and reaching for his gun belt before the knock came 3 firm raps, not desperate but determined. He opened the door and the storm came in with her, a cold gust that made the lamp flicker and sent papers sliding off the desk. He looked at her. She was younger than the storm had made her seem from a distance. He put her at around 26 or 27. Though the road had put some weight in her expression that made her seem older. She had dark eyes, not brown exactly but a deep amber that the lamplight caught in a way that made him think of autumn, of the last warmth before a hard winter. Her face was all angles and determination, a strong jaw and a straight nose and a mouth that was currently pressed into a thin line of controlled exhaustion. She was not what anyone would call soft-looking. She was what anyone with sense would call remarkable. "Sheriff Crawford," she said. Her voice was steadier than he would have expected, given that she was standing in a puddle of her own making and visibly shaking from the cold. "That's me," he said. "Get inside." She came in and he closed the door behind her and the storm stayed outside where it belonged. "My name is Virginia Easton," she said, turning to face him. "I've come from San Antonio. I have a situation that requires your attention." He was already pulling the spare blanket off the cot in the corner and holding it out to her. "Sit down first," he said. "Whatever the situation is, it'll keep long enough for you to stop shaking." She looked at the blanket as if she was going to argue, and then she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat in the chair across from his desk. And he noticed that even then she sat straight, her spine not touching the back of the chair. It was the posture of someone who had been taught that how you held yourself told people who you were. He put the cold coffee on the little iron stove and added wood to the fire beneath it and listened to the storm press against the windows while she collected herself. "I'm sorry to arrive in this condition," she said after a moment. "Don't apologize for a storm," he said. "You didn't make it." That made her look at him differently, a quick sideways glance that reassessed something. "No," she said. "I suppose not." When the coffee was hot again, he poured her a cup and set it in front of her and then sat down behind his desk and waited, because in his experience people told you what they needed to tell you faster if you didn't push them. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth come into her palms, and then she said, "My father was James Easton. He owned a cattle ranch in Carson County, about 90 miles southeast of here. He died 6 weeks ago." "I'm sorry," Silas said. "Thank you." She paused and he watched her decide something. "He left the ranch to me. He had no other children and my mother died when I was 11. The ranch is called the Double E, about 4,000 acres, good grazing land along the Canadian River. It's not an empire, but it's a sound operation. Was a sound operation." "Was," Silas repeated. "A man named Doyle Prout has decided that he would like it to be his operation instead." She said this without drama, just a clean statement of fact which he respected. "Prout runs cattle on the land north of the Double E. He came to see me in San Antonio 3 weeks ago. I had gone there to see my father's lawyer about the estate, and he offered to buy me out. I told him I was not interested in selling. He then explained, in very polite language, that he felt certain I would reconsider." "And how did he back that politeness up?" "The foreman I hired to keep the ranch going while I handled the legal matters sent word that Prout's men have been cutting our fences and scattering the herd. 2 of our cowboys have quit. The foreman himself, a good man named Raphael Torres, was found last Tuesday with a broken arm and a broken nose. He says he fell from his horse." She paused. "Raphael Torres does not fall from horses." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Carson County has its own sheriff." "Carson County's sheriff is a man named Harold Betts," Virginia said, and the way she said it told him everything he needed to know about Harold Betts. "I went to see him before I came here. He told me that fence disputes between neighbors were civil matters and suggested I sell the land and go back to San Antonio where I'd be more comfortable." "What made you come to Harding County?" "My father spoke of you," she said, and something changed in the room, a subtle shift, like the air pressure before a second storm. "He said Silas Crawford was the most honest man he had ever met in the Texas Panhandle. He said that if I ever found myself in a place where honesty was the thing I needed most, I should find you." The silence between them stretched. Silas looked at his hands on the desk. "When did you know James Easton?" "He came through Red Rock in the spring of 1880, Virginia said. "You helped him recover a string of horses that were stolen from his remuda while he was transporting them north. He said you rode 3 days and brought every horse back." Silas remembered. A quiet man with steady hands and a good hat, James Easton had been. A man who knew horses the way some men knew scripture, with reverence and precision. They had talked around a fire one night before they found the horses, and Silas had liked him in the simple, uncomplicated way you sometimes liked a person you met once and knew you wouldn't see again. "He was a good man," Silas said. "Yes," Virginia said, and her voice did something small and complicated that she shut down quickly. "He was." Silas looked at her for a long moment. The rain outside had settled from its furious opening act into a steady, serious downpour. The lamp between them cast a warm and flickering light across her face, catching the amber in her eyes, illuminating the mud still drying on her left cheekbone, the exhaustion she was refusing to show. He was not, he thought, a man who made decisions quickly. He had trained himself out of quickness. Quickness got people killed in this part of Texas, or it got them into situations they spent years trying to get back out of. He believed in measured responses, in taking the time to see a thing clearly before acting on it. He decided in approximately 30 seconds. "I can't cross county lines with any legal authority," he said, "but I can ride with you to Carson County as a private citizen, and I can introduce myself to Doyle Prout and let him take a good look at me and form whatever conclusions he sees fit. Sometimes that's enough. And if it's not, then we'll figure out what's next when we get there." He stood up. "There's a room available at Mrs. Webb's boarding house. I'll take you there tonight. We'll leave in the morning if the storm breaks." Virginia looked at him from across the desk, and for the first time since she had come through his door something shifted in her expression, something careful and guarded that loosened just slightly at its edges. "Why would you do this?" she said. "You don't know me." "I knew your father," he said, "and I don't like Doyle Prout's methods." "You don't know Doyle Prout." "I know the kind," he said. She held his gaze for another moment and then she nodded once, and the thing that had loosened went carefully back into place. But he had seen it, and he did not forget. He took her to Mrs. Webb's, who was the kind of woman who could be woken at 10:30 on a stormy night and respond with immediate practical warmth, producing dry towels and a warm meal and a room with a proper lock on the door without making anyone feel like an imposition. Virginia thanked her with a dignity that was genuine and went upstairs without ceremony. Silas walked back through the rain to his office. He sat down at his desk. He looked at the pen. He picked it up. He had not done this, not like this, not with intention in 7 years. The pen felt familiar in a way that hurt, the weight of it, the smooth wood, the small resistance of the nib. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him and he sat with it for a long time, the lamp burning low, the rain speaking its patient language against the windows. He wrote 3 sentences. He crossed them out. He wrote 2 more. He stared at them. He was writing to his brother Thomas in Missouri. Thomas, who he had not spoken to in 7 years, who had written 4 letters in the first 2 years after Silas left and then stopped when none came back. Thomas, who had been 20 when everything happened, who was now 27, who Silas calculated must have his own life by now, his own choices, his own understanding of the person his older brother had become. He wrote, "Thomas, I have been a coward about writing. I am sorry for the silence. "I am well. I hope you are too." He looked at what he had written. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But it was the first words he had put on paper in 7 years that were not official documents, and they sat there on the page looking back at him like something that had been waiting a long time to be born. He folded the letter and put it in an envelope, and wrote the address from memory, and set it on the corner of the desk to go to the post office in the morning. Then he blew out the lamp and went upstairs and lay on his cot in the dark, listening to the rain ease, and thought about a woman with amber eyes and straight spine, and the kind of courage it took to ride 90 miles through a panhandle storm alone, and he felt something stir in the locked-up interior of himself like a room that had been closed too long and was getting its first breath of outside air. He told himself it was simply the fact of helping someone. He told himself that plenty of times. The storm broke before dawn, and the morning came in clear and cold and blue, the kind of morning the Texas Panhandle produced after a hard rain that felt like an apology, brilliant light and scrubbed air, and the smell of wet earth that was as close to perfection as the prairie got. Virginia was already at the livery when he arrived, and her bay mare was fed and rested and looking somewhat better than she had the night before. Virginia herself was wearing dry clothes, a dark brown riding skirt and a cream-colored blouse and a canvas riding jacket, her dark hair pulled back severely at the neck. She had the look of a woman who had gotten 5 hours of sleep and decided that would be sufficient. Silas had his own horse, a gray gelding named Jack, steady and strong and not given to opinions about things that were none of a horse's business. He saddled Jack while Virginia checked her mare's legs, and they exchanged a few words about the route and the probable condition of the roads after the rain, and then they set out south in the crystalline morning light, and the town of Redrock watched them go without making a production of it. They rode for the first hour in a companionable silence that Silas found he did not need to fill. He was used to silence, had built his life around it, and he had expected Virginia to be the kind of woman who talked from nerves, which he would have understood and tolerated. But she rode quietly, watching the land the way people watch things that mattered to them, with attention and without performing the attention. She had clearly been on a horse most of her life. The way she sat, the way she moved with the mare's stride rather than against it, that came from years. Around mid-morning, they stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Virginia sat on a flat rock and pulled her jacket closer against the sharp air and said, without preamble, "How long have you been in Redrock?" 4 years, he said. "Where before that?" He looked at the water moving over the stones. "Various places, mostly Colorado." She waited, and when he didn't continue, she said, "My father told me you were from Missouri originally. He had a good memory. He paid attention to people," she said, not as a correction but as an explanation. "It was one of his best qualities. He said you talked about your family the first night around the fire." Silas was quiet for a moment. The creek ran cold and clear and fast from the rain. "I had a brother," he said. I have a brother. You say it like you're not certain. We haven't spoken in 7 years." She looked at him then, not with pity, which he would have found unbearable, but with a kind of direct regard that acknowledged a difficult thing without making it worse. "That's a long time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She turned back to the water. "I wrote to my father every week," she said. "Even when I was in San Antonio and things were busy and there wasn't much to say. Even when the letters were only a page. He said he looked for the envelope on Thursdays." She paused. "He died on a Thursday." "I'm sorry," Silas said, and he meant it the way a man means something when he's been near enough to a particular kind of loss to understand its specific gravity. She nodded, accepting the condolence without ceremony. "What I'm saying is," she said, "that letters matter. The not writing of them matters too, in its own way." He did not answer, but something in him took note of the words and held them carefully. They ate cold biscuits and dried beef at noon, sitting against a limestone outcropping while the horses grazed on the sparse autumn grass. Virginia pulled a small notebook from her saddlebag and went over some figures, numbers related to the ranch, head counts and acreage and the amounts Prout had offered. And Silas read over her shoulder when she tilted the book toward him, which she did naturally, without self-consciousness, as if she had already decided he was someone who could be trusted with the information. He appreciated the trust and did not say so because saying so would have made it awkward. She had clearly managed the practicalities of the ranch from San Antonio while handling the estate, because her figures were detailed and current. The Double E ran about 1,200 head of Longhorn Durham crosses, which was a respectable operation for 4,000 acres in that part of the Panhandle. James Easton had been methodical, careful with his breeding program, careful with his water rights, careful with the relationships he'd built with the cattle buyers in Dodge City. It was not a flashy outfit, but it was a solid one. "Prout offered you 42 cents on the dollar," Silas said, looking at the number she'd written down. "That's generous for a man who thinks he can just take it," she said dryly. "He's covering himself legally," Silas said. "If you sell under pressure, he can say you sold willingly." "I know that," she said. "I have no intention of selling." He looked at her profile. "Even with Tor's hurt and the Cowboys leaving, especially then," she said. "If I run every time someone makes things uncomfortable, I'll spend my whole life running." Silas looked back at the figures. "Your father taught you ranching." "From the time I could walk," she said, and something warm moved through her voice, the first real warmth he had heard in it, the warmth of old love remembered. "He used to put me on a horse before I could reliably sit up. My mother thought he was reckless. She was probably right, but I can sit a horse in a lightning storm, so it worked out." "You can," he confirmed. She glanced at him. Was that a compliment, Sheriff Crawford? It was an observation. "Then I'll take it as a compliment," she said, and shut her notebook and stood up and brushed the crumbs from her skirt. "We should make good time this afternoon if the roads have drained." He watched her move toward her horse and thought, entirely against his better judgment, that James Easton had done something right in this world at least. They reached the outer edge of Carson County by late afternoon and the Double E by early evening, and the sight of it made something shift in Virginia's expression, a complicated mixture of grief and ownership and determination, three things that did not sit comfortably together but which she carried all at once. The ranch house was solid, adobe and timber, built low against the wind with deep covered porches front and back. The barn was large and well-maintained. The corrals held about 24 horses and a small working group of cattle that had been held close to headquarters. The rest, Virginia explained, were scattered across the eastern range after Prout's men had cut the fence lines. Rafael Torres met them in the yard, his right arm in a rough sling, his face carrying the yellow-green remnants of the beating he'd received. He was a man of about 40, compact and capable-looking, even damaged, with a calm, dark gaze that took Silas in and measured him quickly. "Miss Easton," he said with evident relief, "I'm glad you made it." "I'm glad you're standing," she said, going to him and inspecting his arm with a directness that was clearly familiar to both of them, not hovering or sentimental but practical, checking that the sling was right, asking him to move his fingers. "This is Sheriff Silas Crawford from Harding County. He's here to help." Torres looked at Silas with cautious assessment. "You have authority here." "Not officially," Silas said. "I have a reputation and a presence and a willingness to use both." Torres considered this and then said, "That may be enough. Prout's men have been watching the ranch road. They know Miss Easton came back. There will likely be another approach from Prout by tomorrow." "Good," Virginia said. "I'll be ready for it." She was. When Doyle Prout arrived the next morning with 2 of his men and his lawyer, riding up to the Double E's front gate with the studied casualness of a man who doesn't think he's going to be surprised, he found Virginia Easton standing on the front porch with her arms at her sides and Silas Crawford standing 3 steps behind her and to the right, his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression entirely neutral. Prout was a large man, florid-faced, somewhere in his early 50s, with the specific kind of confidence that came from decades of getting what he wanted through a combination of money and the suggestion of force. He looked at Virginia with the practiced patience of a man who expected her to be grateful he'd come in person, and then his eyes moved to Silas and stayed there. "Who are you?" he said. "Silas Crawford," Silas said, "Sheriff of Harding County. You're out of your jurisdiction." "I'm aware of that," Silas said pleasantly. "I'm here as a private individual, visiting a friend." Prout looked between them and recalculated something. "Miss Easton," he said, turning his attention back to Virginia, "I've come to make you a revised offer. In light of your recent difficulties, I'm prepared to increase the figure by—" "No," Virginia said. Prout blinked. "You haven't heard the number." "The number doesn't matter," she said. "The answer is no. It was no 3 weeks ago in San Antonio, it's no today. It will be no next week and the week after that. The double E belongs to me. It was my father's and now it's mine and it will stay mine. Are we clear on that point?" Prout's jaw tightened. His eyes went to Silas again, doing the calculation of what the sheriff's presence meant and what it would cost to ignore it. Silas said nothing. He simply held Prout's gaze with that steady, storm-colored regard and let the silence communicate what words would have made too explicit. "The fence disputes," Prout said carefully, shifting his approach. "There's been some confusion about the boundary line on the north section. My men may have—" "Your men cut 300 yards of new fence on the north section," Virginia said. "The boundary is marked with survey posts that have been there since 1871. There is no confusion unless confusion is a policy." Prout's lawyer cleared his throat. Prout ignored him. "I'm simply saying that these things can escalate in ways that are difficult for everyone," he said, and the pleasantness in his voice had gone the particular thin quality of a man delivering a threat while maintaining he was doing no such thing. "A woman running an operation this size, alone, without adequate protection—" "She has adequate protection," Silas said. It was the first thing he had said in several minutes, and it landed in the morning air with a quiet finality. Prout looked at him. Silas looked back. There was a long pause during which everyone on that porch and in that yard understood something about the nature of the situation that had not been fully understood before. "I'll be in touch," Prout said finally and turned his horse, and his men and his lawyer turned their horses, and they rode back down the road toward the North Range. Virginia stood on the porch until they were out of sight and then let out a breath she had been holding. "He'll try something else," she said. "He will," Silas agreed. "But today he's thinking it through instead of acting without thinking. That buys time." She turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said, and unlike the polished gratitude she had offered Mrs. Webb or the transactional acknowledgement she had given Torres, this was simpler and quieter and more genuine, the kind of thank you that came from a real place. "We're not finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we've started." Over the next 3 days, while Silas helped Torres organize the fence repair crews and Virginia worked to bring the scattered cattle back in from the eastern range, something began between them that neither of them named or acknowledged directly, which was perhaps appropriate for the place and the time. People in 1883 in the Texas Panhandle not being given to announcing their feelings with any particular urgency. It was in the evenings, mostly. The days were full of work, hard, physical, dusty, satisfying work, the kind that filled a person up and left them without enough energy for complicated thoughts. Virginia could rope and brand and doctor a sick calf and read a map and calculate a head count to the dollar, and watching her do these things was an education. She worked alongside the cowboys without condescension and without performing competence either, just doing the work because the work was there, and she knew how to do it. But the evenings were quieter. After supper, which Torres cooked better than anyone had a right to expect from a ranch cook, Virginia and Silas sat on the back porch looking south over the dark range, and they talked. Not about Prout mostly. Not about the practical logistics of holding the ranch. They talked about other things, the kind of things that came up when two people were tired enough to let their guards come down by a few degrees. She told him about her schooling in San Antonio, where she had spent 3 years at a women's academy and learned enough about mathematics and literature to satisfy her father's ambition for her education, and enough about the impracticality of the curriculum that she had been glad to come back to the ranch. She told him about the books she had read there, which were more and better than anything available in Carson County, and the teachers who had been genuinely interesting people, and the girl who had become her closest friend and then married a railroad man and moved to Denver. He told her about Colorado, which surprised him even as he was doing it. He told her about the mining camps north of Denver, where he had worked as a deputy before the work dried up and the lawlessness got to a level that convinced him to move on. He told her about the mountains, which were nothing like the Panhandle, vertical and dramatic, where the plains were horizontal and patient, and how they had gotten into him in a way that he still sometimes felt, a kind of longing for elevation. He did not tell her about Missouri. Not yet. Not about Thomas or about what had happened 7 years ago that had closed off his correspondence with the world. But he was aware that the subject was there between them, present in the same way the dark range was present beyond the porch light reel, waiting, neither pushing nor receding. On the fourth morning, Prout made his next move. It was not violent, which was the right call on Prout's part. A smart man, if a corrupt one, knew that outright violence against a woman who had a witness present would land badly even in a county with a cooperative sheriff. Instead, he filed an injunction in the Carson County Courthouse, claiming that the boundary survey of 1871 was in dispute and that the Double E's north fence line encroached on his property. It was a legal maneuver designed to tie up the ranch's operations in court, while Prout continued the economic pressure of disrupting the cattle and discouraging hired help. Virginia read the injunction papers that the county clerk's writer delivered and said something very precise and unladylike under her breath, and then said, "I need a lawyer." "Your father's lawyer in San Antonio," Silas said. "Robert Aldridge, yes." She was already at the writing desk in the parlor, pulling paper toward her. "He's a good man. He handled the estate. I need him up here." "The circuit court sits in Amarillo," Silas said, coming to look over her shoulder at the injunction. "The survey is a matter of public record. If you can produce the original survey documentation, it's in the deed box," Virginia said, moving to the large iron strongbox in the corner of the office. She unlocked it with a key from a chain at her belt and sorted through the papers within with quick, precise hands and produced a folded document that she spread on the desk. "The 1871 Harding-Carson survey, north boundary markers clearly noted. Prout's claim is nonsense, but it's expensive nonsense." "Who was the surveyor?" She looked. "E.J. Marsh, federal surveyor out of the General Land Office in Austin." "Marsh is still active," Silas said. "He surveyed part of the Harding County boundaries 2 years ago. I dealt with him." Virginia looked up at him. "You think he'd come and testify?" "For the right fee and a formal request through proper channels, federal surveyors generally cooperate with property disputes. Their credibility depends on it." He paused. "I know a man at the territorial court in Amarillo. He's honest and he's fast and he has a deep dislike of what he calls legal harassment." She looked at him steadily. "You've been thinking about this?" "Since last night," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved behind her amber eyes that was more than gratitude, a recognition, a kind of wonder at finding what she had found in the place she had been looking for, simply competence and help. She turned back to the desk before either of them could do anything about it. "I'll write to Aldridge," she said. "You write to your man in Amarillo." They wrote their respective letters at the same desk, their elbows occasionally nearly touching, in a silence that had become one of the most comfortable silences Silas had inhabited in a very long time. He was aware of her beside him with a consciousness that was almost physical, the way the air changes near a fire even before you are close enough to feel the heat. He finished his letter to Judge Carmichael in Amarillo and blotted it and folded it, and then, without fully planning to, he picked up a fresh sheet of paper and wrote one more letter. To Thomas. A longer one this time, 3 full pages, filling in 7 years in honest language, not excusing himself, not explaining too much, just saying what he could say and asking how Thomas was, and admitting that he had been wrong to let the silence go so long. Virginia noticed him still writing when she had finished her own letter and sealed it. She did not comment. But as she stood and gathered her papers, she paused behind his chair for just a moment, and he felt that pause the way you feel something that isn't quite a touch but is in the same family. The letters went out that afternoon with the ranch's regular mail rider, who made the Carson County Post run twice weekly. Aldridge arrived from San Antonio 8 days later, which was fast enough to be impressive. A trim man in his 40s with a quick analytical mind, and a suitcase full of legal documents, and the manner of someone who took professional pride in not being rushed. He assessed the injunction and the survey documentation and Virginia's records with methodical efficiency, and by the second evening he said, "Pruitt's claim has no merit. The survey is irrefutable. The question is how long he can make this drag out, and whether you can sustain the operation financially during a protracted legal dispute." "How long?" Virginia asked. "If we push for an expedited hearing and get the federal surveyor's testimony, 3 months. Possibly less, if your Sheriff Crawford's contact in Amarillo is as useful as he suggests." "He's not my sheriff," Virginia said, and there was something in the way she said it that was both accurate and also not quite entirely true, and she knew it, and she said nothing further. Aldridge looked between them with the discreet perception of a man who had been a family lawyer long enough to read the weather in a room. He went back to his papers without comment. Judge Carmichael's response to Silas's letter arrived from Amarillo 4 days after the letters had gone out. The judge was indeed both fast and efficient, and he had written to the Federal Land Office in Austin about E.J. Marsh's availability before he had even finished reading Silas's full account of the situation. Marsh, it turned out, was already scheduled to be in Amarillo in November for another survey matter, and the judge had arranged a court date for the Double E boundary dispute that fit Marsh's availability with what the judge called in his letter, "a satisfying neatness that suggests Providence is occasionally on the right side." This left approximately 6 weeks to manage the ranch through the legal delay and ensure that Pruitt's harassment didn't escalate to a level that damaged operations irreparably. Silas sent a telegram to Cody Fitch in Reed Rock, explaining that his absence would extend through November, and asking Cody to handle things in his absence, which Cody responded to with a telegram that said only "fine, take your time," and which managed to communicate, in 4 words, that Cody had formed some conclusions about what was keeping his sheriff in Carson County and was entirely supportive. The 6 weeks that followed were the kind of time that Silas would not, in later years, be able to describe with any sort of precision, because the days were full of too many small and vivid things that made precision feel inadequate. He worked the ranch with Torres and the remaining cowboys, because work was the structure that held everything else up, and Virginia was always there, always present, her dark hair catching the morning sun when she rode out on the mare, her voice clear across the yard when she was directing the day's plan, her laugh infrequent but genuine, usually produced by something Torres said, or by one of the young cowboys doing something unexpectedly graceful. A sound that reached him from across a distance and made him feel something he did not immediately have a name for. He found it eventually. The name was belonging, the particular feeling of being in a place where your presence made sense. He had not felt it in 7 years. One evening in late October, about 3 weeks into his extended stay, they rode out together in the late afternoon light to check the north fence line, which Torres' crew had fully repaired and reinforced with an extra strand of wire. The land was beautiful in October in the way the Panhandle was sometimes beautiful when you were in the right frame of mind to see it, enormous and open, the grass golden from the autumn, the sky so blue it looked painted. The Canadian River caught the light to the east, a silver thread through the golden land. They checked the fence posts methodically, Virginia pulling at the wire to test the tension, Silas checking that the survey posts were undisturbed, and when they had covered the full northern boundary, they pulled their horses up on a low rise overlooking the range and sat for a moment without any particular purpose except being there. "It's good land," Silas said. "It is," Virginia said. She was looking south, toward the heart of the ranch, where the lights of the house were just beginning to be visible in the dimming afternoon. "When I was a child, I thought it was the most boring view in the world. Flat, nothing happening." She paused. "Now I think it might be the most beautiful place I've ever seen." "What changed?" She thought about it. "I went away," she said. "You don't see a thing clearly until you've been away from it and come back." He looked at her profile against the evening sky. "I haven't been back to Missouri in 7 years," he said. It came out without him planning it. She turned to look at him, and there was that careful amber regard, steady and without pressure. "What happened?" she said, not as an interrogation, as an invitation. He looked out over the flat gold land for a moment. "My father," he said. "We had a disagreement about my choices, about my work, about who he thought I should be and who I was." He paused. "It became a rupture. I left. I told myself it was his fault. For a long time that was easier than the alternative. And now I'm 43 years old," he said, and then corrected himself. 31, I'm 31. He shook his head slightly. "I feel 43 sometimes." Virginia said very quietly, "Your brother, Thomas. He wasn't part of the argument. He was just there, caught between. I left him behind when I left, and I've never quite forgiven myself for that." "Have you told him?" "I wrote to him," Silas said, "the night you came to my office, and again last week." She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was something he could not fully read, something warm and careful and honest. "Good," she said. "That's good, Silas." It was the first time she had used his first name, and it landed somewhere inside him like a stone into still water, ripples going outward from the point of impact. He looked at her. She was looking at the ranch lights. "Virginia," he said. She turned. He had not planned what he was going to say. He found, looking at her, that he did not need to plan it. "I don't know how to do this," he said, gesturing between them with one hand, a gesture that encompassed the conversation and the evening and the thing that had been building since the night she had knocked on his door in the storm. "I've been out of practice with most things, for a long time, but I find that I'd like to not be out of practice with this, whatever this is." Her expression did something complex and quiet. "You're telling me you have feelings you're not sure how to handle," she said. "I suppose I am." "That makes 2 of us," she said, and then she turned her horse south toward the house and said, without looking at him, "We should get back before it's fully dark." He followed her, and the Panhandle evening came down around them like a blessing, and he was smiling in a way he had not smiled in a very long time. Things shifted after that, incrementally, the way things shift when people have acknowledged something to each other but are moving carefully through the acknowledgement. He sat beside her at supper now rather than across the table. She handed him his coffee in the morning with a particular small attention to the fact that he took it without sugar. He fixed a section of the corral's fence on a Thursday afternoon, not because it was his job to fix it, but because he saw that she was going to do it herself, and he thought, unreasonably, that he would rather do it for her. She caught him at it and did not comment, but she sat on the top rail and talked with him while he worked, which was better than any comment she could have made. Aldridge observed all of this from behind his legal papers, with the discretion of a professional, and occasionally found reasons to be in a different room. Torres, who had known Virginia since she was a girl and had very clear opinions about her welfare, observed Silas Crawford for 3 weeks with the careful attention of a man responsible for someone important to him. At the end of 3 weeks he told Virginia, while they were working in the barn one morning and Silas was across the yard mending tack with one of the cowboys, "He's a good man." "I know," Virginia said. "Your father would have approved." "I know that too," she said, and focused on the horse she was grooming with the particular focus of a woman who did not want her expression examined just at that moment. Torres went back to his work without pressing further. A letter arrived from Thomas Crawford in the first week of November. Silas read it in the privacy of the little room he was using at the ranch house, and he read it twice, and then he sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the letter in his hands for a long time. Thomas was well. Thomas had married a woman named Helen 2 years ago, and they had a daughter who was 8 months old. Thomas was working as a schoolteacher in Independence, Missouri, which was a fact so perfectly improbable that it produced in Silas a sudden sharp laugh that surprised him. Thomas wrote that he had given up being angry a long time ago and that he had not entirely given up hoping, and that the letter arriving had been, his words, like getting a window open in a room that had been shut too long. Silas put the letter away and found Virginia on the front porch with a cup of tea and the ranch's account book, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked up and saw something in his face and closed the account book. "Good news," she said. "My brother is a school teacher," Silas said. "He has a wife and a baby daughter." Virginia's face broke into a smile that he hadn't seen before, full and unguarded and brilliant. "That's wonderful," she said. "He says the letter was like getting a window open," Silas said. She held his gaze. "It was that for you too, wasn't it?" "Several windows," he said, looking at her. She understood what he was saying. He could see that she understood. She looked back at her account book for a moment, and then she looked up again and said, "Silas, come sit down." He came and sat in the chair beside her, and she closed the account book entirely and set it aside, and they sat in the November morning, and she said, "What are you going to do when this is finished? The court date. When Prout is dealt with and the boundary is settled." "I go back to Red Rock," he said, because that was the obvious answer. "Yes," she said, "and I stay here." The distance between Red Rock and the Double E was 90 miles, which in 1883 in the Texas Panhandle was not an insignificant distance, but was not an impossible one either. He understood what she was laying out, not as an objection, but as a fact they both needed to look at. "That's true," he said. "2 counties," she said. "Also true." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not leaving the Double E," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly. It's not stubbornness. It's that this ranch is what I have of my father and what I owe to the people who work here and what I've been fighting for. I can't leave it." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to." "Then what do you want?" she said, and it was a direct question asked without coyness, looking at him straight. "I want more than 90 miles between us," he said. It was as direct as he could manage, and it was entirely honest. She looked at him for a long moment, something turning over behind her amber eyes. "Then we have something to figure out," she said. And she picked up the account book again, but this time she sat a little closer to him, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and she tilted the book so he could see the figures, and they spent the rest of the morning going over the ranch's accounts together, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the conversation had happened, and it was in the air between them, and nothing was going to put it back the way it had been. The court date in Amarillo came on the 14th of November. They rode up together, Virginia and Silas, along with Aldridge and Torres, who was recovered enough to ride though his arm was still stiff. Judge Carmichael held his court in a proper courthouse that was one of Amarillo's larger and more serious buildings, a 2-story structure that took itself and its function with appropriate gravity. E.J. Marsh, the federal surveyor, was a small, precise man with spectacles and an exhaustive commitment to accuracy who took the stand and walked the court through the 1871 survey with a clarity that left Prout's lawyer with very little to work with. The boundary markers were where they were. The documentation was where it was. The north fence line of the Double E was on Double E land, and had been for 12 years, and any claim to the contrary was, in Marsh's careful technical language, inconsistent with the documented survey record. Aldridge was excellent. He was concise and methodical, and he had prepared well, and he introduced the survey documentation, the original deed, and 3 affidavits from ranchers who had worked neighboring land and knew the boundary markers by sight. Prout himself sat in the courtroom in his expensive coat, looking less and less comfortable as the morning progressed. Judge Carmichael, who was indeed the kind of judge who disliked what he called legal harassment, dismissed Pruitt's injunction at noon and made several remarks from the bench about the appropriate use of the court's time that were directed at Pruitt's lawyer with unmistakable purpose. He also noted, for the record, that should further claims of this nature be brought against the Double E's title without substantive basis, he would be looking very carefully at the motivations involved. It was not quite the end of Doyle Pruitt. Men like Pruitt rarely ended cleanly. But it was a clear and public reversal, and it changed the calculation that Pruitt had been making, because the calculation now included a federal judge with a demonstrated interest and a sheriff from the adjacent county who had demonstrated his own kind of interest in a very different way. On the ride back from Amarillo, Virginia said very little for the first hour, which Silas understood as a kind of processing, the release of weeks of sustained tension, the settling of a thing that had been kept taut by necessity. When she finally spoke, it was late afternoon, the light already going orange, the plains stretching vast and gold around them. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "This was your fight." "It was our fight," she said, looking at him, and she said it with a simplicity that closed the subject. Aldridge, riding a few lengths behind them with Torres, found something interesting to look at on the horizon. That evening, back at the Double E, Torres cooked a celebratory supper that involved a quantity of beef and a bottle of whiskey that had been stored in the pantry for what he called the right occasion. The cowboys who were still on the ranch, 5 good men who had stayed through everything, whose loyalty Virginia acknowledged explicitly and specifically at the supper table, celebrated with the particular pleasure of people who had held on through difficulty, and were now allowed to feel the relief of having held on. After supper, after the cowboys had gone to the bunkhouse and Torres had gone to his room and Aldridge had retired to his, Virginia and Silas stood on the back porch again in the November cold, and the sky above the Panhandle was extraordinary, clear and black, and packed with stars in that particular extravagance that the plain sky achieved when the air was cold and dry. She was standing close to him, close enough that their arms were touching along their full length. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "That night," she said, "when I came to your office, you were sitting at your desk before I knocked." "Yes." "What were you doing?" He thought about how to answer. "Nothing," he said. "And then you knocked and I opened the door, and after you left I picked up a pen for the first time in 7 years and wrote to my brother." She turned her head to look at him and the starlight caught her face. "Why?" she said. "Why that night?" "Because," he said, and found that he was turning toward her, that his body was making a decision his mind was only just catching up to. "Something came back. Something I thought I'd put down permanently. You walked in with the storm and something came back." "What came back?" she said, and she was turned toward him now, their faces close in the cold dark, her amber eyes very serious and very present. "The sense that things matter," he said. "That writing to someone you love matters. That what's between people matters. That it's worth the risk of caring about it." The word love had appeared in that sentence in an oblique way, attached to the brother, but it was there, and she heard it, and they both knew what it meant in its fuller application. She said, "I rode 90 miles through a lightning storm because I was afraid," she said. "Because I didn't know how to do this alone, and I remembered a name my father gave me and I followed it. I followed it because it was the only thing I could think of. And now I'm standing here and I'm still afraid, but it's a different kind of fear. It's not the fear of losing the ranch. It's the fear that this," her hand moved between them in the same gesture he had used on the rise overlooking the north pasture weeks ago, "is something that can't survive the practical difficulties of 90 miles and 2 counties and lives that are already rooted. I'm not rooted to Redrock," he said. "I'm good at my job there, but the land doesn't have me." She went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that a county like Carson County needs a sheriff," he said. "And that Harold Betts clearly isn't filling that position adequately." Virginia stared at him. I'm not proposing anything official tonight," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. I'm just observing that there is a practical solution to a practical problem, if someone were inclined to look for one. The breath she let out was something between a laugh and a release of weeks of held feeling. "You are extraordinary," she said. "I've been told I'm very calm in a crisis," he said. She laughed then, genuinely, and the laugh dissolved the last of the careful distance she had maintained, and she stepped into him in the straightforward way of a woman who had made up her mind, and he put his arms around her in the natural way of a man who had been waiting. And for a long moment they stood like that on the back porch of the Double E, with the Panhandle stars overhead, and the cold air around them, and the warm certainty of each other. And there was nothing provisional about it. He kissed her, finally, carefully and then not carefully at all, and she kissed him back with the same honest directness with which she did everything. And the stars were extraordinary, and the cold was irrelevant, and 7 years of silence had produced, against all expectation, something that felt like the truest thing he had touched in a very long time. Inside the ranch house, in the pantry, the whiskey bottle still had a few fingers left in it, as if it had been saving something for exactly this. The weeks that followed were ones of reconstruction, not just of the ranch's disrupted operations, but of the shape of two lives being rearranged around each other. Silas wrote to Cody Fitch in Raydrock, a longer letter than the one he had sent when he extended his stay, a letter that explained what was happening in the way that a man writes to a trusted deputy when the trust runs deep enough for honesty. Cody's response arrived 10 days later and was, characteristic of Cody, effusive with approval and practical with information, confirming that things in Raydrock were running fine, and that if Silas was thinking what Cody thought he was thinking, then Cody was fully in favor of it, and also that the widow Greer had asked twice when Silas was coming back, to which Cody had said he wasn't sure, and the widow Greer had looked pleased rather than disappointed, which Cody said was a strong hint that the widow Greer's interest in Silas had been more about the lack of competition than any particular attachment. Silas read this letter aloud to Virginia over breakfast, which produced one of her full, unguarded laughs and a comment about Cody Fitch being worth his salary. The conversations with Carson County's existing political establishment were less entertaining but more consequential. Harold Betts, Carson County's inadequate sheriff, had seen enough of Silas and of Pruitt's courtroom reversal to read the writing on the wall, and when a delegation of Carson County ranchers, led by a solid man named Amos Garrity, who had grazed land adjacent to the Double E for 15 years, and who had been deeply unimpressed with Betts's tenure, approached Silas formally about the possibility of standing for county sheriff at the next election, Betts had the self-awareness to announce, 2 days later, that he would not be seeking another term. It was a tidier resolution than Silas had expected. He accepted the rancher's invitation to stand for election with the straightforward acknowledgement that he would bring to Carson County the same standards he had maintained in Harding County, and that anyone who had a problem with that could exercise their franchise accordingly. He would not take office until after the election in the spring, but the decision was made, and with it the last practical obstacle to a future that had already begun to feel inevitable. He went back to Raydrock in December to formally resign his position and collect his few belongings and close the chapter of his life there with the respect it deserved. Cody, promoted to acting sheriff pending a Harding County election of their own, shook his hand at the door of the office with the particular dignity of young men who are determined not to make a scene. "You'll write," Cody said. "I'll write," Silas confirmed. He had, after all, gotten back into the habit. He returned to the Double E on the 20th of December with his gear and his gray horse and a small wrapped package, which he gave to Virginia on Christmas morning, along with a letter 3 pages, which she read twice, sitting in the parlor chair by the fireplace, and which she folded with great care and kept. The package contained a pen, a very good one, silver-fitted, the kind that was made to last. He had bought it in Amarillo, "because you write to people you love," he said, "and because it matters. She looked at him over the letter and the pen with those amber eyes full of something that was past words. "Silas Crawford," she said. "Virginia Easton," he said. "Marry me," she said. He blinked. "I was working up to asking you that." "I know," she said. "You were going to do it in the careful, measured way you do everything. It was going to be beautiful. But it's Christmas morning and I'm holding the letter you just gave me, and I don't want to wait for the careful, measured version." He looked at her for a moment, and the smile that moved through his face was slow and deep and entirely genuine. "Yes," he said. Tors, who was in the kitchen and had been attempting to be quiet, dropped something metallic that clattered loudly on the floor, and then said something in Spanish that was either a prayer of thanks or a curse of startled embarrassment, possibly both. They were married in March, at the church in the town of Stratford, which was the largest nearby settlement with a proper minister. Virginia wore her mother's ring, which had been in the deed box with the ranch documents, a fine gold band with a small garnet that caught the light in a way that reminded Silas, absurdly and correctly, of her eyes. Amos Garrity and his wife stood up for them, and Tors was there in a good hat, and Aldrich came down from Amarillo because Virginia had written to him, and because he had, he said, a professional and personal interest in seeing the matter concluded happily. Cody Fitch rode in from Ridge Rock, which was 90 miles and which he did in one very long day because he was 23 and enthusiastic, and had already been promoted to sheriff of Harding County by popular acclaim, and felt the occasion warranted the effort. Silas's brother Thomas was not there, because Missouri was a long way and he had a young daughter, but he wrote a letter that arrived the week before the wedding, and which Silas read out loud to Virginia in the evening, and which said, among other things, that he was glad his brother had found his way back to the world, and that Helen was pressing him to plan a visit in the summer when the baby was old enough to travel, and that he thought a man who had been silent for 7 years and had finally put pen to paper had clearly found something worth writing about. The wedding was simple and joyful and right, and when they walked out of the church into the March sunshine, Virginia's hand in his arm, the panhandle wind blowing with its usual confident opinions about everything, Silas felt something so complete and unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it. He was happy, not the absence of pain, which was what he had been settling for, not the maintenance of sufficient quiet. Actual happiness, which was a different thing entirely, heavier and lighter at the same time, full of specific details, the weight of her hand on his arm, the sound of Tors whooping somewhere behind them, the way the sun hit the pale grass of the plains and made it look like something worth staying for. He stayed. He won the Carson County Sheriff's election in April by a margin that suggested Harold Betts had made more enemies than anyone had taken the trouble to count, and he came to the job with the same standards he had brought to Harding County fair, firm, consistent, and in possession of a deep dislike for men who used institutional power to harm the people it was supposed to protect. Doyle Prout kept his cattle on his own land and his lawyers in their offices, a fact that Silas noted with satisfaction every time he rode the north boundary of the Double E on his county rounds. The summer that Thomas came to visit was one of the best summers Silas could remember. Thomas was smaller than Silas's memory had made him, lighter, with a teacher's air of patient enthusiasm and their mother's eyes. He arrived with Helen, who was a warm and direct woman with a dry sense of humor that Virginia immediately appreciated, and their daughter Clara, who was 14 months old and had very decided opinions about most things and a spectacular laugh. Thomas and Silas spent 3 days doing the tentative and careful work of brothers who have been apart long enough to have become somewhat different people, finding the old familiarity underneath the new growth, establishing the language of a rebuilt relationship that was different from what they'd had before the rupture but honest and solid in its own way. They talked about their father who had died 2 years earlier, which Silas had not known. He sat with that for a while. He had not been there. He could not go back and be there. He let that be true and let himself grieve it without letting it become another locked room. "He asked about you," Thomas said on the second evening, sitting on the front porch while the women were inside and Clara was asleep in the portable crib they had brought. Near the end, "He wanted to know if I'd heard from you." Silas was quiet. "I told him I hadn't," Thomas said, "but that I thought you were probably all right." "Thank you for that," Silas said. "It was what I believed," Thomas said. "I didn't know it, but I believed it." They sat with the panhandle dark around them and the stars doing their extravagant thing overhead, and Silas felt the specific grief of a thing that could not be fixed and the specific relief of a relationship that could still be repaired, and both of those things were real and he held them both. Virginia found him later, sitting on the back porch after Thomas had gone to bed, and she sat beside him without asking anything, just present, her shoulder against his. "You okay?" she said after a while. "Getting there," he said. "He seemed glad," she said. "Thomas, to be here." "He was," Silas said. "So was I." She took his hand, which was something she had taken to doing with the same natural authority with which she did everything, just taking it, because it was there and she wanted it, and he curved his fingers around hers. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For riding 90 miles through a lightning storm," he said. "For knocking on my door, for making me pick up the pen." She looked at him with those autumn eyes. "I knocked on your door because I needed a sheriff," she said. "And now?" "Now I need you," she said, simply and truthfully, in the way she said true things without decoration. He lifted her hand and held it to his face for a moment, the back of her hand against his jaw, and she let him, and the night was enormous around them and entirely sufficient. The seasons turned after that, as they do. The ranch prospered. Virginia's careful management of the cattle operation, combined with the stability that came from having the boundary dispute resolved and the harassment ended, allowed the Double E to rebuild and expand. She negotiated a favorable contract with the Dodge City buyers that her father had cultivated, and she added a small horse breeding operation on the southern acreage that Torres ran with a quiet passion that was very good for the horses and very good for the ranch's accounts. Silas was a good sheriff, which was neither a small thing nor a simple one in Carson County in the late 1880s. The Panhandle was changing. The large cattle empires were running up against the homesteaders, and the range wars that had bloodied other parts of Texas were simmering at the edges of every county. He dealt with these conflicts the way he dealt with everything, with patience and directness and the firm, consistent application of the law, and he did not pretend that the law was always sufficient or always fair, but he enforced it as well as any man could who was trying to enforce it honestly. He wrote letters regularly, to Cody in Reed Rock, to Thomas in Missouri, to Judge Carmichael in Amarillo, who had become a genuine acquaintance, to E.J. Marsh, the federal surveyor, who turned out to have interesting opinions about land use policy, and with whom Silas maintained a sporadic correspondence that he found genuinely engaging. Writing had come back to him the way something comes back after a long winter, not like a new discovery but like a recognition, the understanding that this was always a thing he had known how to do and had only needed the right reason to do it again. Virginia read everything he wrote, or most of it, because she was his wife and he showed her things, and she had opinions about most of it, and her opinions were worth having. In the spring of 1885, she told him she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast, in the same direct way she said everything, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him across the table and saying, "I'm going to have a baby," with the expression of someone who has decided to simply state the fact and observe the response. His response was to sit very still for approximately 3 seconds and then to get up and go around the table and pull her to her feet and hold her, which was the most efficient way he could think of to express a feeling that words were temporarily unequal to. "Silas," she said, into his shoulder. "You're going to crush me." He loosened his arms immediately. "Not really," she said, and pulled them back. Torres, who was outside and had not heard any of this, happened to glance through the kitchen window on his way past and gave a startled look, and then walked on with a very deliberate regard for the middle distance. Their son, James Silas Crawford, was born in November of 1885, on a night that was cold and clear and full of stars, in the bedroom of the ranch house, with a good midwife from Stratford and Torres pacing the kitchen, and Silas sitting beside the bed holding Virginia's hand, with the focused entirety of a man who has understood for the first time in his life what it means to have everything in one room. The baby was loud from the first minute, which the midwife said was a good sign, and which Virginia said sounded familiar. "He sounds like someone I know," Virginia said, exhausted and radiant, holding the wrapped bundle with the careful certainty of a woman who learns things quickly and holds them well. "He sounds healthy," Silas said, which was the truest thing he could say, though it was not close to the only thing he was feeling. James Thomas Crawford Thomas, when he heard the middle name, wrote back a letter that took a paragraph to contain itself, grew into a solid and curious child, and the double E grew around him, and the years arranged themselves into the kind of life that looks ordinary from the outside and feels like tremendous good fortune from the inside. Doyle Prout sold his operation in 1887 and relocated to Kansas, which everyone in Carson County noted with the satisfaction of a resolved irritation. Harold Betts moved to Lubbock and was occasionally mentioned in the context of whatever mediocre thing he was doing there. Raphael Torres' arm healed completely, and he expanded the horse-breeding operation until it was genuinely one of the finest small remudas in the Panhandle, which gave him a satisfaction that was entirely deserved. Cody Fitch proved to be an excellent sheriff of Harding County, and he came to visit the Double E twice a year, which were occasions of considerable noise and general enjoyment. He married a schoolteacher named Agnes in 1886 and brought her along on subsequent visits, and Agnes and Virginia formed a friendship based on a shared appreciation for competence and a shared ability to manage enthusiastic men, which made the visits even better. Thomas and Helen made the journey from Missouri again in the summer of 1887, this time with 2 children, Clara and a new baby boy named Robert, and the visit lasted 3 weeks and involved a great deal of riding on the part of Thomas, who had apparently decided to remedy a lifetime of Eastern habits, and a great deal of conversation between Helen and Virginia that produced 3 long-standing correspondences about everything from children to cattle to the state of women's legal rights in Texas, which Virginia had strong opinions about and which Helen shared and encouraged. Silas watched all of this, his brother and his wife's friend and the children playing in the ranch yard and Torres explaining something about a horse to Thomas with elaborate patience, and felt the specific quality of abundance, the sense of a life that had filled up with the right things in the right ways. He had been, he knew, a man who had nearly let himself empty out entirely. 7 years of silence, of careful controlled insufficiency, of a life lived at a temperature just high enough to maintain function and not a degree more. He had told himself this was strength. He had told himself that asking nothing from the world meant the world could take nothing from him. He had been wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when they confuse invulnerability with safety. Virginia had ridden in on a stormy night and shown him, simply by being herself direct and determined and honestly afraid and courageously present, what a person could be when they didn't close themselves off from the possibility of being hurt by it. She had come to him for practical help and had given him, without intending it, the example he had needed for years. She found him one evening in the fall of 1887, standing at the fence of the south pasture, watching the horses run in the long light. James, 2 years old and already opinionated about horses, was sitting on the top fence rail with his father's hands holding him there, and they were watching a 3-year-old chestnut gelding figure out the pleasure of running without purpose. "Look," James said, pointing at the chestnut with absolute authority. "I see him," Silas said. Virginia came up beside them and leaned on the fence and watched the horse. The evening was warm and golden, and smelled of grass and horses, and the particular clean dryness of the Panhandle autumn. James reached for his mother, and Silas transferred him to her hip with the practiced ease of a year and a half of parenthood, and she settled the boy on her hip, and he immediately pointed again at the chestnut. "Look," James said to her. "I see him," Virginia said. She and Silas looked at each other over the boy's head, and she was smiling and he was smiling, and the horse ran in the golden light, and the distance between them was nothing, and the distance behind them all of it, the storm, the letters, the fence lines and the courtrooms and the slow, careful work of finding each other, and then finding themselves, was simply what had been required to get here. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear with one hand, a small and ordinary gesture, the kind that means nothing by itself and everything accumulated. "I love you," he said. He had said it before, of course, in the months and years since they had figured out what they were to each other, but he said it now with the specific consciousness of a man who understood what the words had cost him once and what they meant when he could say them freely. "I love you," she said, without hesitation, in the voice she used for true things. James, not particularly interested in the adult conversation when there was a horse to look at, pointed again and said, firmly, "Look." They looked. The chestnut was beautiful. The evening was long and golden and complete. In the spring of 1888, Virginia told him she was pregnant again, and this time he did not sit still for 3 seconds. He lifted her off the ground, which made her laugh and tell him to put her down, which he did, and then he kept his hands on her waist and looked at her with an expression she later described to Helen, in a letter, as one that should be preserved somewhere because she had never seen anything quite like it on a human face, and was fairly certain it was one of the rarest expressions available to the species. Their second child was a daughter, born in October, and they named her Clara Margaret Crawford, the Clara for Thomas's daughter and the Margaret for Virginia's mother. Clara came into the world with less noise than her brother, but considerably more observation, looking around with sharp dark eyes from the very first hour, as if she was already forming assessments of everything she saw, which Virginia said was entirely reasonable, and Silas said suggested she was going to be terrifying in a courtroom someday, and Virginia said she hoped so. James, at 2 years and 10 months, met his sister with the profound ambivalence of a small child, confronted with something that has radically altered his previously satisfactory arrangements. He studied her for approximately 4 minutes from the safe distance of the doorway, and then walked to his mother's bedside and climbed up with the careful determination of a climber who has not yet mastered the technique but has absolutely mastered the will. And he sat beside Virginia with one hand on the baby's head and declared with 2-year-old authority, "Mine." "Yes," Virginia said gravely. "Yours." He seemed satisfied with this. Silas watched his children grow into themselves the way you watch something remarkable when you are aware enough to be watching. James became a boy who loved horses with the same deep instinctive passion his mother had, spending every free hour he could manage in the corrals with Tors, who taught him with the same patient precision he brought to everything. Clara became a girl who asked questions about everything and listened to the answers with complete focus, and then asked 3 more questions, and who at the age of 5 had already expressed an interest in reading everything in the house and had been given free access to the considerable library her mother had accumulated over the years. They were, Silas thought, exactly who they were going to be. They had not yet had time to be anything other than themselves, and it was a privilege of the first order to be present for that. He wrote about them to Thomas. He wrote about Virginia, and the ranch, and the horses, and the Panhandle seasons, and the cases that came across his desk as sheriff, and the people of Carson County who were his charge and his community. He wrote the way he worked carefully, honestly, with the conviction that the thing you were doing was worth doing well. Thomas wrote back about Clara the schoolgirl, and Robert the active toddler and Helen's expanding involvement in the growing suffrage movement that was making its arguments in Missouri and across the country, which interested Virginia intensely when Silas read the letters aloud to her, and which led to a direct correspondence between Virginia and Helen on the subject of women's legal rights that produced, over the following years, a number of strongly worded letters to the territorial legislature in Austin, and at least one that Silas was fairly certain had ended up being read into the record of a committee hearing. He was proud of her for it. He told her so. She told him she didn't need his pride, which was true, and then she told him she was glad to have it anyway, which was also true. The Double E marked its first decade under Virginia's sole ownership in 1893, with a cattle operation that had grown to nearly 2,000 head, and a horse breeding program that Torres had made regionally respected, and a ranch house that had been expanded twice to accommodate family and the kind of regular visitors that a life lived openly produces. Raphael Torres had finally accepted Virginia's long-standing offer of a partnership stake in the horse operation, which he had resisted for years on grounds of propriety, and eventually accepted on grounds of being worn down by her persistent reasonableness. And the formalization of that arrangement was celebrated with a supper that Torres cooked himself and declared to be the finest meal ever prepared in Harding Carson territory, and nobody who ate it was inclined to argue. Silas served as Carson County Sheriff through 2 more elections, which he won with the unspectacular margins of an incumbent who does the job without drama and without scandal, which was exactly how he liked it. He was known, by the time he had been in the county 5 years, as the kind of man you could bring your dispute to and expect a straight answer, and as the kind of man you did not want to be on the wrong side of if the wrong side was truly wrong. He was also known, by the late 1880s, as the man who had married Virginia Easton and could frequently be found riding the Double E's range on his county rounds with a small boy up in front of him on the saddle, which humanized him considerably in the estimation of those who had found his solidity slightly intimidating. James, at 7, decided that he was going to be the best horseman in the Panhandle, which Torres said was an achievable ambition, and one he was fully prepared to assist. Clara, at 5, decided she was going to read every book available to her before she turned 10, which was also an achievable ambition, and one that her mother was fully prepared to assist. Silas and Virginia looked at their children and felt the particular pride that parents feel when their children are becoming themselves well, which is not the pride of ownership but the pride of witness. On an evening in late October of 1893, 10 years after the night the storm had broken over the Panhandle, and a young woman had knocked on a sheriff's door and changed the course of 2 lives, Silas sat at the desk in the ranch house study, the desk that had been James Easton's and was now his, in the room that served as both the ranch's office and his personal writing space, and he was writing letters. He had 3 on the go at once, which would have been unthinkable to the man he had been before Virginia, the man who had not written a single word in 7 years. One to Thomas, one to Cody, one to Judge Carmichael, who had retired from the bench the previous year and was writing a memoir about his time on the territorial court, and had asked Silas to contribute his recollections of the Double E boundary dispute as a case study in legal harassment and its appropriate remedies. Virginia came into the study with 2 cups of coffee and set one at his elbow and looked over his shoulder at the letters in progress. She was 36 years old, and the decade had done nothing to diminish her. There were lines now at the corners of her amber eyes, and her dark hair had its first threads of silver, and she wore all of it with the same fundamental quality she had always had, which was the quality of a person who was entirely herself and found that sufficient. "All 3 at once," she said, amused. "Making up for lost time," he said. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the way she passed through a room where he was working, touching him as she went because he was there and she wanted to. He caught her hand before she could move away and held it for a moment. "Virginia," he said. She looked down at him. "I picked up a pen the night you rode into my county," he said, "and I haven't put it down since." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those autumn eyes, full of 10 years of shared life and all its specific weight and warmth. "I know," she said. "I watched." "Thank you," he said, "for what you gave me back." She pulled her hand free, gently, and sat in the chair beside the desk instead of leaving the room, settling in the way she settled when she intended to stay a while. She picked up her coffee cup and curled her feet under her in the chair, a habit he had long since stopped, pointing out was undignified for a woman who was also a rancher and a sheriff's wife and a territorial correspondence activist, and she looked at him across the lamplit space. "You gave it back to yourself," she said. "I just knocked on a door." "In a lightning storm," he said. "In a lightning storm," she agreed. "I was very dramatic," he smiled. "You were extraordinary." She looked at him for a long moment. "So were you," she said softly. "You just didn't know it yet." Outside, the Panhandle night was enormous and clear and cold, and the stars were doing their extravagant thing. And somewhere in the house, their son was sleeping with one arm around a stuffed horse that Tors had made him, and their daughter was most certainly still awake, reading by the light of the small lantern she kept by her bed, and had strict instructions to blow out at a reasonable hour. And the double-ease horses were moving in the dark pastures with that quiet, purposeful movement of horses at night. And the Canadian River ran silver somewhere to the east, and the land was vast and patient and entirely real. Silas turned back to his letters and wrote, and the pen moved across the paper with the ease of long practice. And Virginia sat beside him and drank her coffee and read a book she had borrowed from the circuit traveling library that came through Stratford twice a year. And the lamp between them burned warm and steady, and everything was closed and complete and good.